Work session is now beginning. We have all board members here, the manager, and today's topic is in our budget work session for fiscal year 2022 is the Department of Environmental Services, which covers so much of what we do as a government. So we will have a presentation from Mr. Emanuel and others, but to start, we'll send it to the manager, Mr. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. We'll dispense with any elaborate introductions. We have a huge amount of material to cover in 2 hours. So over to Mr. Emanuel.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, and the community we all serve. So this year I'm backed virtually with a very capable staff across our many lines of business. That includes the director's staff that supports the operational units and the operational leaders. However, of course, the real department is out there hard at work as we speak, maintaining and operating the infrastructure and facilities 24/7. And that includes our contractors providing services like refuse and transit. And of course, our staff that leads the community to change in areas like energy and the environment. So as you mentioned, our agenda today will cover many funds, many different areas. Because there are more significant proposed budget changes in the stormwaters and utilities this year, we'll lead with those and then switch back to the general fund and a handful of others. So Mike Collins is going to help me with the utility rate slides since he has skillfully shepherded that effort for a couple of years. So we have a lot of slides. I'll go fast and at a high level. And at your direction, Mr. Chair, we'll break for questions when you see fit. But it seems like a good break after stormwater is a good place to maybe introduce our friends from E2C2. And then we could have another break potentially after the utility slides.
Sure.
Since we're covering a lot of ground today, I just wanted to ground our budget request in the context of our departmental mission and vision. So, the infrastructure projects often get a lot of community attention because they are temporarily disruptive. But of course, most of what we do in the operating budget is operations and maintenance and excellent customer service. And we do that all in a sustainable way. This year was different with the pandemic. We added skill sets. I would say that we became the master agents of creative change to support the community during the pandemic, in addition to all our normal work. We've done so much and we continue to support COVID, going from hundreds of PUDOs and TOSAs and free art rides through the rear door, to modifying facilities and signage for distancing, deep cleaning for areas with positive COVID cases. Then we had a session of massive early voting and tax collection on the ground floor in a short-term licensed facility. Then we went on to we went through significant increases in residential solid waste. We suffered a temporary suspension of yard waste, which we then refunded back to our customers. And that was back to fare collection recently in January with protection for our art bus drivers, while also providing utility bill relief. And then we had an incredible ramp up of support for vaccination calls and unprecedented call volumes with a multi-departmental effort. And then this week, after months of planning with APS, we are now supporting their reopening with new signs and drop-off zones, and even a temporary lane closure on South Carlin Springs Road. That's a pilot that will provide more space for students and expanded walk zones to Kenmore. All of this while taking care of our workforce. I guess what makes every department's unique, but what makes DES very unique is through the pandemic is that 65% of our workforce was coming in physically every day. It's just a really large group of almost 500 people that were coming in every day. And the other thing that makes it unique is that this workforce in particular is 69% minority. And I just want to, tip my hat to them and thank them publicly for their ongoing work. They just truly deserve our respect and support. We have seen both opportunities and challenges in our workforce during COVID. The remaining 35% doing telework. Some like it, some very much, and some dislike it. And then, of course, everywhere in between. People have replaced their commute time with in some cases, more work time, or they've moved to lower cost areas, and in some cases, achieved better life balance. We attracted and onboarded new talent. Well, of course, we also lost talent. And on that note, I just want to take this opportunity to recognize one notable loss of talent. Our Facilities Management Bureau Chief, John Murphy, his last day is tomorrow. And for over 20 years, John has so capably and quietly kept our facility systems and services humming. He instituted a really successful critical systems infrastructure program that supports so many critical functions in the county. And of course, he's just delivered amazing customer service 24/7 across over 80 facilities. So thank you, John. We just really want to honor, respect, and publicly thank him. And of course, true to John's professional form, he has built a strong team and done a great job of hiring and mentoring, so we will continue on. Meanwhile, the infrastructure and facilities work, plus other services, never went away. Our team and our contractors stayed on the job. We delivered the 53,000 square foot Lover Run Community Center on time and in budget last September. Claudia O'Connor, our new decision support chief, as of I think earlier this week, led the replacement of Public Stuff and Report a Problem app with QSend, a new software, and that provides more options, better integrations, and better feedback to the customer. ART significantly improved on-time performance, even while our drivers and riders were adjusting to the pandemic. We pulled glass out of the residential mixed recycling stream, and our residents went the extra mile to deliver 5 million pounds of glass at 3 local drop-off points. Despite the pandemic, we still paved over 90 lane miles, repaired nearly 2,000 sidewalk hazards, and accomplished 11 signal upgrades or additions. We proposed, and then fortunately the voters supported, just over $50 million stormwater bond, and a stormwater utility feasibility study is underway, and LDA 2.0, as we're calling it, is about to launch. Most importantly, for that 65% of our workforce coming in every day, sometimes riding in vehicles together, and now wearing masks while doing the tough work indoors and outdoors, I'm very proud to report that we had our best safety year in a decade. When you look at that critical, the critical metric of lost time and restricted work injuries rates, that's a true testament to our workforce and how they work safety and have discipline in spite of the pandemic and all its stressors. Finally, we continued our CEP transformative efforts. We purchased 10 new EV Leaf sedans, which should arrive around the 4th of July. Now, the board may recall that was a scale back from our original target of 23. That was driven by many pandemic factors, including lower mileage, the budget, and a need to defer replacements. And in some cases, our decision to eliminate vehicles. And of course, eliminating vehicles is even more friendly to the environment than anything. But of course, there's a lot more happening in here. We reached milestones and continue work this year across the entire arc of the portfolio, in buildings, renewables, and energy, in the government, and in the private sectors. So the board will remember the recent Green Building Incentive Policy update, which included an equity element for the first time. We also are working with Ann Venezia in the housing on building standards for affordable housing projects, making that part of the criteria to move the needle. A comprehensive EV strategic plan is underway. We received 3 interim deliverables last week, which include cost of ownership for various vehicle types, and that will help us zero in on our next opportunities. We're going to have to work with Dominion through this. As EVs scale up, there are huge implications on the grid capacity. That's just something we got to face and work as a team. The EV planning is integrating with our ART bus EV feasibility study and simultaneously informing the design of our maintenance and parking facility in Arlington. The pandemic can kind of warp our sense of time, but it was just last January when we closed the deal on the solar PPA. It took us a huge step forward to our goal of 100% renewables for government operations by 2025, and construction in Pittsylvania County should begin soon. Importantly, after the county board adopted the new CEP with the aggressive goals, we embarked on an updated CEP implementation framework with extension. I'll simply say this: we got a lot of feedback, and there's a lot of community energy behind a lot of ideas. In fact, 63 strategies. So then as we rolled out the strategies, we got more feedback. And we are now going to go through a process over the next 6 months to refine, structure, and prioritize those 63 strategies as part of this year's internal work plan. And we've already shared that with our friends in C2E2. The roadmap or blueprint will illustrate how the strategies work together on the wedge chart to achieve the ambitious goals of the CEP. In the government setting, here's another way to say that. The CEP implementation overlaps with so many other master plan implementations, from the housing master plan to the master transportation plan, and we're getting in all those spaces. From a resources view to support the CEP in air, we have what we need in terms of consultant money for anticipated needs. And if an opportunity pops up, we won't waste it. If we need more expertise, we have the budget flexibility during execution to make that happen. Excuse me. We acknowledge receipt of recent letters from C2E2 and others with their thoughts on personnel working the implementation. I just want to share our mindset on that. To scale up and really achieve the goals of the CEP, it is not done in our minds with more layers or the air team growing. Instead, we're thinking bigger than that. We are enlisting the actions of all 3,500 county employees, and of course, many more in the community. So with all that going on, how did we approach the need for reductions this year within those intertwined budgets of the general fund and other funds, the DS? First, we took a comprehensive and deliberative deep dive into multi-year budget execution trends. We decided where we could take cuts and at reasonable risk while minimizing those service impacts to our customers and risk to the infrastructure. So while admittedly that reduces our operational flexibility, we do that in the context of a financially strong and well-managed government. What it really means is we're less likely to deliver savings at the end of year end of 22. The comprehensive look across our budget also led us to recommendations, in some cases, to move funding sources where it was appropriate, or simply to catch up financially with what was actually happening. Next, even in a tough budget year, the timing is right to move ahead on things that have been in motion for a long time, including food scraps for residential customers, now that we've secured an agreement where they can actually be received and composted. And as I mentioned, Lower Run has been a kind of a wrapped present waiting for opening when the timing is right after the pandemic. Next, we decided it was time to operationalize the recommendations from our water utility rate study and the long engagement with a new rate structure. And we'll implement that 6 months into the fiscal year with your approval. And it'll take some time, though, to make the system changes. That's why it'll be mid-year. And then finally, with the voter support of the stormwater bond and the imminent Reed School detention project solidified, the timing was right to ask for the first rate increase in stormwater in a long time, since our last one was in 2011. So meanwhile, we're studying for the utility. We're doing stormwater as a utility, as another funding option behind the scenes. We'll bring that to the county board and the public as appropriate and provide some time and space from the new water sewer rates, so there's not confusion with the public relative to the stormwater utility. Okay, so let's just jump straight into the stormwater. Bottom line, we are proposing a 0.4 cent tax rate increase, going from 1.3 cents to 1.7 cents for calendar year 21. This would cover our funding needs in both FY22 and FY23, and we do not anticipate coming to the board with a funding request in 23. It would fund the increase for maintenance capital and debt service on water capacity projects. We'll also touch on our ongoing utility feasibility work, which then in turn may affect future budget cycles. Also, our stormwater working group, it moved from study to implementation during the pandemic. Last summer, we rolled out our blended engineering strategy as part of the CIP. We are now moving to development of a draft flood resilient design manual, which will be a tool for voluntary resilience. And just a quick update on the flood sensors, because the board funded those. in the right-of-way. Here we have identified 2 key intersections. That work requires kind of hard to get specialty contractors, but we are progressing. The timing is still uncertain, but we're targeting those to be installed by early summer. And then, of course, the work on the ramp also continues, the risk assessment and management plan. Finally, in the big picture, in the realm of stormwater and its needs over time, we're expecting the state to issue our next MS4 permit very soon. The first round was 5% requirement. Our second round has another 35%. We're on track for that. And then there'll be a third round after this one for meeting our TMDL. So for stormwater, by the numbers, this is how it looks. The proposed rate increase of 0.4 cents shown on the bottom there translates to a revenue increase at the top, which we then apply to the debt service and capital in the middle. Debt goes from basically 0 to 662 when we issue the bonds. And capital from 1.75 to 4.25 million, which is a 242% increase, which really reflects our commitment to action, with no changes to staffing levels proposed. So this slide shows current capital projects underway this fiscal year and the plan for 22 and 23, a significant increase and across multiple watersheds with larger scale capacity projects. While we still execute simultaneously water quality projects and the 4-mile run dredging jointly with Alexandria. Near term, I briefly mentioned the $18 million Reed and other detention projects. Those will use modular concrete cells like those shown here on the lower right. So we'll bring the plan in a special use permit for the Reed project in the form of an MOA with schools to you later this month. And with your approval, then those dollars will flow to APS this fiscal year to implement a big change order on their project. To fund this work, we are using a mixed strategy of existing fund balance, funding from the proposed rate increase, and bonds as shown here. And this is a game plan of significantly more project execution. Here's how it plans out for the average household. The stormwater sanitary district rate increase, the impact would be $29 as shown on the bottom line here. It represents then about $123 or roughly 1.2% of the total burden. Another important context is how we fit with our neighbors regionally. As you can see here, even with the proposed increase, Arlington is still very reasonable. So where that green line, the second from the bottom, only Prince William is less, and they have a very different development pattern and history and situation than us. We are proposing one budget reduction in stormwater, and that's to eliminate the Stormwater Wise program. It was a popular and had good outcomes and some good incentives, but we did have equity concerns. And frankly, we just wanted to shift our focus to runoff management and flood resilience. Meanwhile, we are examining the feasibility of funding stormwater through a utility fee funding model instead of the current ad valorem tax rate model. So the utility model would charge residents and businesses based on the burden they place on the system, which is measured by the impervious area of the property, as opposed to assessed values. So under a utility model, the burden will likely shift to property classes that have more impervious area, including single-family residential, churches who are currently exempt, and then other properties with larger horizontal footprints, like strip retail or garden-style apartments. So we'll come back to the board with more analysis later this spring, and we'll seek your direction on whether we should move forward with implementing a utility. However, if we go that way, there's a lot of work to do with a switch. You got to set up policies, procedures, GIS, categorization and work, notices, engagement, and of course, billing mechanisms. So the earliest we would consider implementing that under a new fee structure would be the 24 budget process. So here's where we are in the process. We've done the preliminary work, and we have initial results from phase 1 that focus on the policy and rate considerations. We're now looking more closely at those impacts and to further analyze the rate options that might ease the burden on some of those property types I mentioned. We're also further examining the credit program options, which will be required under state code, and then the billing method we would use. We'll be looking to the board for guidance around the time of the budget adoption. And if the guidance is to move forward with the implementation, we'll do a robust public engagement and outreach, and then work on finalizing a rate structure. Just for everyone and the public especially, there's many benefits and considerations as we look at this option. On the benefits side, the fees are set based on impervious demand, which then can be argued is fair and appropriate and will incentivize the right decisions over time. In our current system, which is ad valorem, there's a very, very weak correlation between assessed value and the impervious area. So you might have a big modern home with a pervious paver driveway that may actually have less or equal impact than a small home neighbor with a long driveway with a garage in the back and a big patio. Stormwater may be viewed more as a fee for service, and that may make it potentially easier to raise the rate when appropriate. Under a utility model, currently exempt properties under the sanitary district tract would be subject to the utility fee, and they would be charged, and they would burden those properties like churches. Lastly, this funding model is in alignment with industry trends. Most of the 19 out of the 20 VAMSA jurisdictions have their programs set up this way. But there are also some considerations here. While it may be more of a fair distribution, the cost burden would shift to single family residential and other properties, as I mentioned. Nonprofits and places of worship would have to pay. Federal properties, however, that have their own MS4 permit would be exempt. And of course, there's some administrative considerations. A credit program will be required. We'll have to set that up. And there will be an ongoing administrative tasks and costs for the program. And of course, those would be in direct proportion to the complexity of the model that we would select. So that's just all a preview of coming attractions on the stormwater utility. It will be a great discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Manuel. Did we say that this might be a good time for our C2E2? I appreciate you flagging that at the beginning. And colleagues, what I'd propose to do is hear now from our Climate Change, Energy, and Environment Commission. And I know we have quite a few slides, but we've worked through 18. I think there's maybe 60 or so in total. So after C2E2 and our chair, Joan McIntyre, who I'll turn to in just a second, if you have questions on this first bucket of the work that we're doing that Mr. Manuel described, then we'll take those questions and do at least one round of questions at that time. But first, Joan McIntyre is our chair of our Climate Change, Energy, and Environment Commission, and we'll send it over to you, Joan, for your comments.
Great, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to speak. And I would want to acknowledge that, we still face a huge challenge with kind of dealing with the effects of the COVID pandemics, but hopefully kind of seeing light at the end of the tunnel. And we certainly applaud the county's effort to try to project existing personnel costs. But, mentioned is climate change is a crisis that remains urgent. And I really recommend that the county board and county manager really start to prioritize the measures necessary for mitigating and adapting to the crisis as the revenue situation returns to normal, and also to position the county to be able to take advantage of potential funding opportunities coming out of the federal and state governments. So as part of the sense that this is a bridging budget, the county should also be thinking of how to bridge to actually starting to flesh out plans that will get the county to climate resiliency and adaptation, and rethinking, kind of across the board how we do things so we can meet our carbon neutrality goals and address many of the other pressing environmental issues. As we recommended in the letter, is that we did we do urge that the county consider putting a individual at the senior level of government in charge of sustainability and climate change. I appreciate Mr. Manuel's that yes, it is something that has to cut across all of the different master plans and across all of the whole county government needs to be, and actually the whole Arlington community needs to be engaged in addressing these issues. But we don't think that this can be done unless there's somebody at a very high level that can make sure that those connections are being made and that the priority is being given to these goals and efforts. With respect to the CEP implementation, again, that's a key area where the county can move forward quickly. And again, is thinking of this as a bridging time and I appreciate that the county is going to be spending the next 6 months of looking at the implementation framework and restructuring it and prioritizing it in a way that will actually give us a real roadmap. As part of that, I think it's important to assess what the personnel needs are going to be within the AIR team and across the government for accelerating the implementation of the CEP. Also to identify what are the studies that would need to be done to further develop a pathway to carbon neutrality for buildings and transportation in particular. And I know a number of those studies are already, either on the books or actually already underway. Likewise, it would be good to have a very comprehensive and clear program as to how the county itself is going to meet its carbon neutrality, both with its getting buildings to zero carbon as well as transitioning the fleet, which I know Mr. Emanuel had made reference to. But actually, I think the county is actually delaying some of the spending on replacing vehicle fleets, so that gives probably a little bit of room for the county to think, more concretely how they can accelerate the shift to electric vehicles. And then again, it's like, what are the projects that the county can be done, and particularly take advantage of any opportunities that come out of the state and federal, and also that can tap into additional funding as the county's revenue situation emerges. But again, thinking this through so that they can quickly take advantage of opportunities. On the stormwater management, I would say that we're really excited about what they're doing, and we're looking forward to working with county staff at addressing these issues of dealing with the aging stormwater system and actually positioning us to deal with the increased frequencies of intense storms on these issues. Actually, we're kind of very excited about the idea of a stormwater utility. We think that probably is a useful way of putting more focus on the cost, on the impact of stormwater to those and helping encourage reduction in impervious surfaces. We do raise the concern that the elimination of the Stormwater WISE program, this actually is a way of working with property owners to actually, limit and slow down stormwater on individual properties. And we think that it should still be part of a broader stormwater management strategy. I obviously recognize that we have to look at considerations for equity issues, but there should be opportunities to means testing and other strategies. And the overall strategy is to making sure that this is equitable as a program. I can also make some comments on solid waste management. Should I just go and make the comments that we had overall in the budget?
Sure. If they're fairly brief, then why don't you do it all?
Okay.
And we'll have
okay. Yeah, again, so we're really excited that they're shifting to the curbside food collection. That was something we had raised last year. So we're looking forward to that. And also, we do appreciate the county's continuing interest in the plastic bag tax. And I know they're trying to work, especially with other jurisdictions, to try to get clarity out of Richmond so that they can move forward. We would like to see, however, that the county, start to move forward on the zero waste plan and with the implementation of the zero waste resolution that was passed over 5 years ago. And we'd actually encourage that the county really kind of go big on this assessment and looking at the broad comprehensive assessment of waste management and look at opportunities to reduce waste generation through reduce, reuse, and repair strategies, as well as just diverting waste. It's important for our carbon footprint overall if we start thinking about how we're reducing the carbon and the material inputs of what we consume. So we do think this is an important approach for addressing climate change. And this is actually outside of the purview of DES, but we did have some concerns related to Parks and Recreation that I would just kind of raise is, again, as part of the bridging effort is last year in the pre-COVID budget, they'd actually proposed adding one forester and funding for preservation of trees. So we think that's important to think about as funding becomes available, and also supporting efforts to, again, I think they've started this already, but managing our deer populations, which are pretty devastating to our natural areas, not to mention some of our neighbors' yards and shrubberies. And then on two other things is that the county proposal is actually going to decrease funding to VCE by $64,000. This is actually a big hit for VCE because it works on a matching funding strategy. So it could reduce staffing there by 60%. And, you know, the services that the county gets from what VCE provides, you know, far outweighs what they're putting into it. So it seems extremely short-sighted on that behalf. And I can say as a master gardener, I saw how the master gardeners really shifted to make sure that we were supporting victory gardens and helping, you know, deal with greater food insecurity in the areas, continued our public education programs. And this was across the board. They, of course, provide programming and financial and nutritional and energy use for individuals and other elements. And then the budget's also proposing to eliminate support for the Northern Virginia Conservation Trust. Conservation trusts are actually an underutilized tool to actually protect our natural resources, and the county should be not only supporting that, but looking for ways of encouraging people to use that as a tool. Arlington's actually one of the few counties and jurisdictions in Virginia that doesn't give tax advantages for property in a conservation trust. So that's pretty much covering the issues that we were looking at in the budget. Thank
you, Chair McIntyre, for your thoughtful comments, and I appreciate you covering a couple of the others. I think what I would propose, colleagues, is that we pause here for questions, and then we will probably go through the rest of the slides with Mr. Emanuel and just as a group so that we can get to questions at the end. And certainly we can also, if you do not have questions now, we can also go forward. But for now, I just wanted to open the floor to questions from colleagues. If you have them, we can also hold and come back to it. Got it. I see Ms. Garvey. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It's kind of a general question, and it may be in here. I realized, I think it's great. Everything we're doing on stormwater. I mean, we really did pivot after that terrible 2019 storm. We're really doing focusing on climate change mitigation of effects. But I realized in the budget, you know, we're talking about all the things we're going to do and the money we're going to spend. I assume there's somewhere or a way to quantify what the output is going to be, or actually it's going to be the diminished output of water, right? So I wonder if there's somewhere to see that, or if it's possible to kind of put that a little bit together so that when we tell people we're going to be spending so much money and doing this and this, it's going to be disruptive, but we're going to diminish, you know, the amount of water by, I don't even know how you measure it if it's for something like this. Do you see what I'm saying, Mr. Emanuel? Does that make sense? Yeah,
it's a great point, and it really it's about the value proposition, right? So
thank you. Yeah.
And so of course, what makes it tricky in stormwater is every single stormwater event is different. So, but for those big storms, like for example the Reed detention wall, so we model that for a big storm. and what it's going to do in a big storm. And I think that's been part of our talking points with the community. And maybe one of my team members can go on the chat or something and tell me the amount of reduction for the particular storm. I don't recall off the top of my head, but that's been part of our messaging. Is like, for this storm, it will save us and reduce the risk by this much. And of course, it'll reduce risk for every single storm significantly. And each project in each watershed, it's going to be a slightly different answer depending on the size of what we do. So we'll try to address that as we can with the community as best we can. And the list of products we put up so far, some of them are in design, so I don't have like firm numbers yet.
and actually, I don't need the firm numbers now. I mean, I don't expect them to have you on the tip yet. That's fine. I know we've done some of that. I'm just realizing, I think to encourage that, so you do get the value proposition. And I think part of the messaging will be, it's making all of this difference, but that still in a large rate event leaves so much water so that people understand we're going to be making it a lot better. Yep. However, we're not going to, it's really about mitigation. We're not going to be able to prevent any kind of flooding. So it's just part of the public messaging. But again, as we get into raising rates and things, that people understand what they're getting for the money we're spending. And I know it's a good value proposition. It's just the clearer we can be about communicating, that's probably the better. So that's just sort of a general comment. As I say, I don't, if you want to give me some numbers later, that's great, but I don't expect them right now. That's fine.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Garvey. That's sort of confidence that we have as to the chances, the improvement in resiliency. We're not getting to zero floods, but the improvement in resiliency. And so we'll come to that. Thank you, Mr. Emanuel, as well. Ms. Crystal.
Thank you so much. So I do, my hand was going up and down for a second as I strategized on the right time I wanted to talk a little bit about electric vehicles in the county fleet. I know that is coming later in your presentation, so I'll hold that for now. I suspect Ms. McIntyre is willing to stay with us in case C2E2 has anything to add in that conversation. Just a pretty straightforward question about the proposed increase in the stormwater tax rate. Really appreciated, Mr. Emanuel. I think you did a great job describing the inequities of doing that as kind of a rider on the property tax rate. We're sort of not taxing the biggest users or generators of stormwater runoff. I at the start of this budget was feeling a little frustrated that we weren't ready to switch to a utility and had to sort of do this interim increase in a rate that feels, or in a tax approach that feels a little inequitable. I have since been convinced at exactly how much goes into switching to that utility model and understand why we're not going to be able to get there. But I wonder if you could forecast at all. I mean, do you anticipate as we shift to the utility model that replaces the tax rate entirely, or an increment of it? Talk to me a little about the relationship of sort of what we're raising now and where we're going in the future.
Yeah, I mean, as we see it, that we have certain fiscal needs for the stormwater. Right now, we're doing it under this model ad valorem. We would then simply switch over to the other one. And we would, at the end game, we would have a different one. We wouldn't have two. There was a brief discussion, I think, in community about having two, but our thought right now is that we would switch from one to the other. Okay, so we're considering an increase, but a temporary one to some extent. Yeah, but I would simply say that the increase total dollar amount, I would say, as we shift from one model to the other, that doesn't mean that the dollar requirement goes down. It's just more thoroughly assessed. The program is going to need what's going to need, but how it plays out on different properties will be very different at that shift point. As you well summarized for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Mr. Karantonis.
A quick question. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation so far, Mr. Emanuel. And I think that my colleagues and we are very well cognizant of the fact that 65% of the workforce of your department is actually during the entire pandemic year has been reporting in person. This is an impressive number of commitment. I wanted to ask you something that is that relates to what Ms. McIntyre has mentioned, and this is the And you actually referred to when you said that climate change, the electrification of fleets, the community energy plan and its implementation opens a completely, the stormwater work opens a completely new perspective on how we deal with all these pressures and all these demands. And Ms. McIntyre mentioned that there is thinking, and we hear it from many people, and from many constituencies, to elevate, to create an additional position at the county manager's office level, just to coordinate all these actions, to see, to make sure that we are sensitive and we respond to how environmental concerns are propagating through the entire government action. What is your initial take on that? Is this something that would be appropriate for this year, or is it something that should be worked on in coordination with all the other areas that you mentioned? Is that for maybe for the future, for next year's budget, for example, or is that something that we should be looking already to this route?
Well, my initial take is I don't want to get ahead of my boss, so I kind of defer to the county manager both in this budget and the future budgets on the strategy, because he's got a much better view on that overall coordinating efforts between the departments.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis and Mr. Emanuel, for the thoughtful and diplomatic way of expressing that. So maybe we can come back to that, as I appreciate your asking, particularly Mr. Karantonis, because it's responsive to the thoughtful comments of Chair McIntyre. So I will be interested in I have a couple of other questions that relate to some of the things Ms. McIntyre mentioned. The studies, and I know electric vehicles is also of interest to you, Mr. Karantonis and Ms. Crystal. I guess what I'd suggest, if it can work for you, Mr. Karantonis, we come back to that question, because I do think it's an important one, but it's relevant to the whole of DES. So would that work for you if we do come back?
Absolutely. It's not only vehicles, it's electrification of buildings, etc. It's a decarbonization, as Ms. McIntyre and the C2E2 Commission has put it. Yes, we can, of course we will get back to that at a later point, even in today's conversation, yes.
That sounds great. And so we can now give the manager a moment to think that through, and we'll go forward. I just, as we do, want to note, Ms. McIntyre, that you've raised with respect to Virginia Cooperative Extension and the Northern Virginia Conservation Trust, two omissions from the budget, or the proposed budget, that I know multiple board members share. And this is part, for those watching, of why it is so important that the proposed American Rescue Plan, which President Biden has put forward, is acted upon to help local governments where we are most on the front lines of providing services. So in any event, we will now go on to the next sections, and I do hope, Ms. McIntyre, you can stay for the remainder of this in case we have questions. But Mr. Emanuel, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll stay on.
Great.
All right, thank you. I'll switch over to the utilities fund now. So let's first look at the utilities in the pandemic. So over the course of the last year, we suspended both late fees and disconnects to mitigate adverse impacts to our customers. That's particularly true when everyone was focused on hand washing and being at home much more than they were used to. That was a big thing that we did very quickly. We also increased accessibility for customers to make payment arrangements. Statewide, toward the end of the year, we became one of the recipients of a CARES grant to help customers with delinquent balances due to COVID. And we've applied about 1/3 of our grant funds so far, leaving about $250,000 yet to be applied to customer accounts. And we continue to reach out to those customers who could benefit. We are also, through our customer service office, assisting the larger countywide effort to take calls and assist residents with COVID concerns and issues. So this has been an amazing thing. So for example, call volumes last week increased from an average where they were before about 500 a week to 5,000. So a tenfold increase. So we still got to serve other customers. So to minimize impact to utilities and refuse customers, we hired temp help to help handle the call volume. But with that kind of a surge, we did have people with longer wait times and higher abandonment rates. You know, we normally have, we try to shoot for about 4 to 6% of abandonment rates. We never want to drop any customer, but that's kind of where we're at. Last week, we had an average abandonment rate of 35%. So to those in the community who haven't been able to get through, just know that we're working as hard as we can. And board members, you might hear some people are disappointed with our ability to answer their calls. However, we think we're hopefully turning the tide here. We are hoping to see some reduced call volumes with the pre-registration calls now being shifted and handled by the state, which has started earlier this week. Okay, during the pandemic, it's been interesting on utilities. We've seen two trends. So consumptions across the county has dropped overall 6%, which means less overall activity of people in the county. That's shown on the right. Plus, within the customer classes, we've had a dramatic shift in consumption patterns as people stay home or telework. So all residential categories have increased consumption, while the general commercial, office, and especially hotels have had a dramatic decrease. If you kind of look at that, those three in the middle there, that shows how much they've dropped off. Meanwhile, we have to maintain, operate, and repair the system everywhere and bill customers, even if the usage drop off. So we did pretty well, but you can see we did have a drop, for example, on our valve inspections this past year. We normally shoot for about 4,000, which is a quarter of the system, but we were only able to reach about 2,900 last year with some, due to a variety of factors. We had, in some cases, alternate scheduling. We had positive COVID cases. We had quarantining of crews that were in contact with those positive cases. And so that affected our normal labor availability rates. And of course, the other element is that we simply chose as a customer service thing to suspend disruptions to water service during those first few months. When you're turning valves on and off, it disrupts people in their homes. And we just didn't want to do that in the early stages of the pandemic when they were adjusting to the pandemic. So, by the numbers for the utility fund. It's somewhat different this year because we are proposing revenue increases associated with fee increases for infrastructure availability fees and water service connection fees. So those are not something we talk about every year, but they were studied, benchmarked, and updated to reflect cost recovery through our rate study process. So what all that means is, while the budgeted expenses increase 2%, we can limit the volumetric water sewer rate increase to only 1%. And then on the expenditure side, the large increases are for utilities pay-go to fund the CIP work and for water purchase also. Fortunately, that was offset. We were paying down some debt service, about $810,000. And of course, we took some cuts that made sense as part of budget execution. So the FY22 utilities budget proposes actually to add 2 FTEs, but they are cost neutral taken together. So 1 additional billing office technician will increase efficiency and productivity while we decrease our reliance on temp employees. The design engineer down at the plant would generate savings by converting a contract person to an in-house employee, and that supports our engineering and capital program at the plant. This is really important given that we have started the solids master plan projects. Those will go over a number of years and upgrades our solids handling process at the plant, in addition to the regular maintenance, capital, and operations. We also scrubbed the books carefully and looked at opportunities on everything from charge outs to eliminating printers to deferring vehicles. So within the utility fund, we're deferring 43 vehicles. Together, all those cuts total $90,000. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Collins to look in more detail at revenues. That's all intertwined with our proposed new rate structure. So Mike has led this effort. Over to you, Mike Collins.
All right, thank you, Greg. So here we show our revenue changes. Greg talked about this just a minute ago. 94% of our utilities revenue, it comes from customer receipts on the water sewer rate. The other 6%, it comes from our interjurisdictional partners. That's Fairfax County, Falls Church, and Alexandria, and from the fees. And Greg already talked about the fees. So let's go on and we'll talk about the rate study next. So as we've mentioned a couple times, we are wrapping up a multi-year rate study, and the manager's proposed budget recommends implementing a number of changes to our water billing practices, water and wastewater billing practices. This study, it was instigated as a best practice because it's been more than 15 years since a formal study was conducted. And I really want to highlight the bullet at the bottom there that the proposals, the rate change recommendations that we're making, they are entirely revenue neutral, other than the fee increases that I just mentioned. So all of the changes that we'll be discussing from this point on, they're revenue neutral. They do not generate, and they're not intended to generate additional revenue. All right, so there's many different billing models for water sewer utilities, and the different models that are out there, they emphasize different values. What you can see in this slide is a list of values which are frequently ensconced in different billing models. And we've so the key effort, one of the key initial efforts we took in this study was to ask our community how they prioritize these values. And what we heard from that was pretty consistent that affordability and conservation, those were the two most important values that we heard from our community that we wanted to incorporate in the rate structure. The third priority was equity across customer categories. And so the rate model that we're recommending, it attempts to reflect these values, to balance these values, because it's important to recognize that all of these values are somewhat in tension with each other and sometimes directly in competition with each other. So it's a balancing effort. So the first, here we'll talk about the rate study, the actual, we'll talk about the actual rate structure that we've developed. And the first thing that we want to notice is that we distinguish our customers by commercial, multifamily, and residential classes, and we bill them accordingly. And we'll describe why we do that a little bit later. The next thing to notice after classes is that we introduce a base fee billed per billing period. So that would be monthly for our commercial and multifamily customers and quarterly for our residential customers. This base fee is calculated to recover a portion of our fixed costs particularly around metering, account servicing, and billing and customer service costs. So for our multifamily and commercial customers, they're billed very similar to our current practice. Other than that base fee. So they get a base fee, but after that, their billing practice remains very much as it is now. They're billed a set constant rate per 1,000 gallons of water consumed. Our residential customers, however, in addition to the quarterly base fee, we've made a number of other changes. So we're proposing a tiered water rate where the first 9,000 gallons of consumption are priced at a rate of $3.71. And then each additional 1,000 gallons above 9, those are priced at a rate of $5.94. So hopefully the values of this pricing are apparent and that they reflect both affordability at the reduced rate for consumption below 9,000 gallons, and then they reflect a conservation message. As customers use higher levels of water, they'll pay higher unit prices. Sewer usage will be billed at a single rate of $9.61 per 1,000 gallons. However, we're proposing a new method of estimating sewer consumption, sewer generation. So it's important to realize that there's no viable technology for metering wastewater generation from a residence. So all wastewater billing methodologies out there, they rely upon estimated generation. The current practice, our current practice today, is that we estimate sewer generation as 100% of a resident's water consumption. So that presumes that every drop of water consumed is returned to the sanitary sewer system. So that doesn't account for exterior uses like irrigation is the obvious one. So what we're proposing with this new rate structure is that we shift to a method known as average winter generation. In this model, we use winter water consumption as an estimate for year-round generation of wastewater. So using this model, a customer's sewer generation would be estimated at the, wouldn't you know it, would be estimated at the lower of their winter water consumption or their current quarter water consumption. So this average winter model that we're proposing, it's become the most common methodology for estimating sewer generation, both in this region as well as nationally. So as we discussed, I mentioned a little bit earlier, we're proposing these different classes of customers with different rates and billing components, and that responds to our community's third priority of equity among classes. And I want to spend just a little time discussing this because the most frequent comment we've received in our public outreach, and that we hear often, is the notion customers should only be billed for what they consume. And that of course is a very intuitive concept, but it's a flawed perception. So one way to demonstrate that is shown here on this slide. So you can see there's a map that shows our water distribution system. And all of the water mains on there, they're coded by their service function. So the residentials are coded in blue, and the mains that serve our multifamily or commercial, they're coded in red. And what should be pretty apparent is that the majority of our physical infrastructure, it's dedicated to serving our residential customers. In fact, we show that in the bar charts on the right. And so if you look at the column on the left in that bar chart, our blue residential water mains there, they account for about 80% of our assets. Now, if you look at the column on the right, which reviews consumption by class, you'll see that that's an inverse relationship. So in other words, our physical assets and associated costs, they're primarily devoted to serving residential customers, but our consumption and therefore our revenue, it is dominated by our multifamily and commercial customers. So a simple pay for what you use consumption model, that transfers costs from our residential customers to our multifamily and commercial customers. So with that really brief background, we go to the next slide, please. There we go. With that real brief background, let's look at what these changes mean for our customers. I'm actually going to start with our multifamily and our commercial customers because these impacts are much simpler. So for our multifamily customers, they will consistently see lower costs in the 1% to 2% range as a result of the lower water unit costs, which reflects the lower costs that these customers impose on the system. Our commercial customers, likewise, pretty consistently, they'll see generally slightly higher rates, typically really in the 1%, maybe to 2% range, due to they have a smaller reduction in their water unit rate because they peak our system a little bit more. But pretty consistent impacts across those two classes. Our residential customers, they see the greatest deal of variation, however, and that's due to the dynamics of the tiered water consumption as well as the average winter sewer estimation. So most of our residential customers will see modest increases, but the impacts, they vary based upon their usage characteristics. So one example of that is on this slide, you can see that a median customer, we picked out a customer at 48,000 gallons annual consumption, which is our median usage, and we modeled their last 7 years of consumption. And their impacts vary over the last 7 years if we were to use this new model. That some year their least impact would be an annual savings of $50, whereas their worst impact would be an increased annual cost of $34. Again, it varies based upon how they used water in that year. So here we're looking at 5 different customers. Again, we picked out 5 different customers to try and illustrate the dynamics that are underway. And these are actual customers that are 10th, 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th consumption percentiles. So across these customers, you see we find cost impacts that range from $27 savings to $115 increased cost at our highest volume user on this chart. So within each of these individual accounts, there's the dynamics of base fee, which adds cost. Then you have tiered water providing savings for our lower and middle volume customers. You get increasing unit costs as you move to the right. But then there's also some moderation of sewer costs in the middle. And so it's a very dynamic range of impacts. So the key message from this is to say that these are just examples, and individual impacts will vary based upon seasonal consumption patterns. So here we show our multifamily customers, and again, as I said, you'll see consistent, modest cost savings from the new rate structure due to the transition to a more equitable cost recovery model. Here we show an average customer on the left, but then we actually picked out two specific accounts. The one in the middle, that's a modern new condominium in the courthouse area. And on the right is actually, that's an AHC property along Columbia Pike. Again, consistent cost savings for all three of these. So lastly, we have a sample of our commercial customers. And like we talked about, within this class, we see consistent, modest cost increases, generally in the range of about 1%. So we've talked a lot. I've talked a lot about the changes to our rate structure that were proposed. In this slide, we're trying to provide some context to those changes and also to talk about our general competitiveness as a utility in the region. So on the left, you see a chart that compares our current rate structure. At the top shows that we have none of these features. We have the most simplistic model you can have. And below that, we show what we're proposing. We compare that then to the rate structures of our surrounding jurisdictional partners or colleagues. And you can see that the changes that we're proposing, well, they're pretty significant to our community. They are the norm for our region. They're also the norm nationally. And then on the right, you see there a chart which you saw a similar example in our stormwater. So us in the green, this model's a 48,000, again, our median customer, median consumption customer. You can see that we continue to be one of the most competitive, economical utilities in the region. We happen to be the cheapest inside the Beltway. So the recommendations that we brought forward for consideration, they're the culmination of 18 months, a little bit more than 18 months of collaboration with the public on this project. And if the board adopts the recommendations, then we will continue the communication and education as we prepare for implementation, which is proposed for January 1st of 2022. It's a big change for the community as well as for our customer service office. So we want to take that time to make sure that it is a smooth implementation. So in January, we shared the findings. We shared our findings of our rate study and our recommendations with our rate study stakeholder advisory group, which is comprised of a number of representatives from the community. And after we received affirmation and support from that committee, we went out and shared the findings with our broad community using postcards, emails, social media. And we also set up a website that had a suite of online resources to help educate our customers on what we're proposing. It also included a calculator tool so that residents could actually pull up their specific account and see the specific impacts on their account. They could also play with the numbers to see how they could change their usage pattern. And then we hosted a virtual community meeting on February 17th, 2 weeks ago. So here you can see the results of our online engagement tool, which I just talked about, where we asked our participants whether the proposed study reflects the identified values. And on the right, on that pie chart, you can see that the opinions of about 1,900 respondents are somewhat dispersed and they don't really provide a consensus conclusion. And one of the challenges, unfortunately, we were not able to obtain feedback from a broad cross-section of our stakeholders. You can see on the left where we illustrate the demographics of the folks, those 1,900 respondents. They were 97% single-family homeowners and heavily skewed towards our higher income levels. And throughout our engagement efforts, we just saw an overrepresentation of that specific demographic. So I want to talk, lastly, I want to close with fall of 2019 before we had COVID challenges. So we were able to get out and do outreach, and we conducted outreach at events like the Latino American Heritage Festival at Arlington Mill. We were a part of the Community Progress Network event at Wakefield High School, again, in the fall of 2019. We hosted events at DHS immunization clinics, and these were not COVID immunizations. These were, I guess, just the traditional flu back in 2019. But unfortunately, those efforts, they did not lead to a significantly higher feedback from these communities. And a key reason for that we just didn't get good feedback from them, I think, is because we did determine that our large multifamily population, large multifamily residential population. It doesn't have a direct customer relationship with us. So, but we continue to try and work to reflect our commitment to equity throughout this study. And you see that in the positive impacts for our multifamily customers. So here, though, you can see how we evaluate our equity framework. The beneficiaries of this study, they are our multifamily customers who see their cost burdens reduced. And conversely, our single-family residential customers probably bear the greatest burden of the system cost and revenue alignment. And that's all we have about the rate study.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. I don't see, really appreciate the thoughtful, thorough presentation. I don't see hands at the moment. So if you can hang on, we'll add questions we might have on that to our last segment, if that works for you. Thank you. Mr. Emanuel.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the general fund. So in our approach to the budget this year, our thinking, of course, was informed by equity. So how do we make those cuts without impacts to residents and customers and service delivery, especially those most in need? So we really looked inward for efficiencies, cost allocations between funds, and areas of savings and budget execution. I just want to highlight our concrete study status. Remember the board last year supported us there. One thing I'm really passionate about is consistently safe sidewalks across all neighborhoods. And the picture in the upper right shows our vendor at work. Just in case you see that kind of unique baby doggy stroller looking thing with a high-tech antenna on it going around the community, that's a field data collection, and that should complete in April. We'll then do the data analytics and a report by the end of the fiscal year. Then looking internally into the department with equity, we formalized our internal equity group with a DEI committee, and we've had focus groups that address the issues unique to our DES work environment and culture. In our approach to the budget, by the numbers for the general fund, we cut nearly $1.5 million from expenses. That's a decrease of 1.3%. Revenues are also projected to slightly drop. Staffing that is home-based and then has an overhead charge in the general fund drops by 5, driven by a proposal to transfer 5 FTEs to the Transportation Capital Fund. 2 of our biggest revenue sources in DES are art revenue and parking meter revenue. Both, as you can imagine, are facing challenges in the pandemic. And we'll go into more details in the next slides. But based on what we're seeing, we have projected lower revenue in FY22 for both of these revenue sources, while still projecting some recovery in FY22. So in terms of helping mitigate some of those challenges, WMATA provided a $7.2 million in federal CARES funding credit to Arlington for local transit. So the budget savings from this credit is now held at MBTC, and it's available for the county to use for transit purposes. So in FY22, we're planning on using $1.65 million of that credit for local transit. And then the remaining balances will be used for future funding challenges for both regional and local transit. Commuter stores fees come from commissions at our commuter stores and online sales. Also not surprising, since public transit ridership is down, so are the commission fees. So to address that revenue shortfall, we've reduced our planned expenditures accordingly in FY22 with a reduced level of marketing and outreach events and reduced contractor support at our commuter stores. So this is a real balancing act, as we simultaneously need to stay in budget, and yet at the same time, we need to take actions to recover and encourage ridership as we come out of the pandemic. And eventually then, as this settles out, we have to also be able to manage whatever the new normal is for telework and transit. So a few more details. The art ridership chart on the left shows a dramatic drop in March 2020, which then recovered somewhat after April. Plus, we were not charging fares until we retrofitted to make it safer for fare collection. FY21 year to date, we are off 55%. Parking also dropped with the pandemic, as shown on the right there, although not quite as significantly. We are recently just over 50% of the prior year. So looking at these revenue sources, we are cautiously optimistic, but uncertain on the timing and slope of recovery for these revenue sources in FY22. And then, as I mentioned, the collective results of future telework and commuting patterns. That in turn will make it challenging to update our transit development plan, which in the future is going to be called a strategic transit plan. We just know there's going to be changes. We just don't know what they're going to be. It's a really hard area to predict right now. The proposed budget does include additional funding in two very targeted areas. Lubber Run, we need an additional $603,000 in FY22 to fully fund facility maintenance over the life of that facility. Garage maintenance and operations, custodial services, and cost at a vehicle. On the food scraps, we appreciate the support of C2E2 on that, and we are proposing to add food scraps starting in September of this year, and we can do that with no budget impact this year. This is how the math works if you look at the symbols on the bottom. Food scraps will cost $9.05 for 9 months. We pay off the green cards this year and make other adjustments, and voila, we can reduce the annual rate down 42 cents to just under $319. So we propose this customer service edition with really, really broad public support. We had a very transparent survey that talked about the cost of the service. We had 4,000 responses and indicating 79% support across all demographics. So if the county board approves, we would then do a multi-month education outreach program on the hows this is done. And we'd pass out the kitchen caddies and the starter bags, and then we'd launch after Labor Day. Now I'll quickly go through our proposed reductions in the general fund, starting with the largest by number. So here, $604,000 is a kind of a casserole of efficiencies and operational budget execution realities. Everything from shifts in budget line items for bus tires, to not needing as much consultant support, to overtime reductions since our leaf trucks can safely run now with 2 instead of 3 man personnel on the vehicle. Of course, with these budget reductions, we lose some flexibility, but we believe these will only minimally impact our services. The $375,000 general fund reduction shown here would charge a portion of the DES general fund overhead and the Bosman rent for those people here to the stormwater fund. This is appropriate and in alignment with how we allocate costs to our utilities fund. We split that out kind of based on the number of people who are working in the different programs. And as I mentioned in the summary, this proposal for $295,000 would transfer 5 project manager coordinators to the Transportation Capital Fund. So these positions already charge a significant portion of their time directly to capital projects. This would transfer the overhead of the positions. We flexibly manage our custodial services at the county with a kind of a mix of contractor and in-house staff. It's about 85 contract, 15 in-house. And that proved to be really helpful during the pandemic. We could quickly adjust. This $174,000 proposal contracts out some more custodian work after the expected retirement of 2 positions. And then we also have a supervisor retiring this year, and we don't plan on filling that position, which then creates additional savings. I just want to mention at this time linkages to other portions of the proposed budget. So under our contracts for custodial services, we pay living wages for those contracts. Most of those custodians work part-time. But we also lease spaces, like here at the Bosman Government Center in Sequoia. Those custodial services are different. They are indirect and they're under leases. And we don't have authorities over the private means, methods, and wages and benefits, particularly like here at Bosman, where we have a multi-tenant scenario. However, we did ask them what they're doing, and we would note that here, for example, at the Bosman Center, they have retention-based paid sick leave that accrues more over time if they stay more years with the company. So in DES, we have many employees who do work and are properly costed to multiple funds. And periodically we check and adjust for their current reality of their workload and their funding mix. So here we're proposing a couple of mix changes for 2 TEO engineers and a budget specialist that totals around 160K. This one is a TBD, but it is a service reduction, so we need to talk about it openly. It's a proposal to eliminate the Metro Bus Route 15K. Many people don't know this route because the ridership is extremely low. So the first trip of the day originates at the Roslyn Metro Station and then operates only between East Falls Church and Langley. The route is operated by the WMATA West Ox Division in Fairfax County and has not run since March of 2020 because WMATA made their service adjustments during the pandemic. So going back to 2018, the county requested and WMATA agreed to remove that Roslyn to Langley portion of the route due to low ridership. Fairfax County then in turn requested the Langley to East Falls Church leg of the route remain, and they are slated to take over the that portion of the route. Fairfax County is in July of this year. It will no longer be operated by WMATA. So how does that pan out for us in the budget? There will be modest budget savings for this in future years in the Metro bus budget, but due to the number of bus route changes, WMATA, and how it impacts the regional funding formula, we cannot tell you today what that savings is going to be. Finally, we kind of thought we'd speed this along and combine 4 slides into one. So consistent with other county programs, we'll begin charging our customers for credit card fees in the RPP program, which the board recently spent so much time on. We eliminated or downgraded many printers. We'll take another run at this in the future, depending on how meetings are in the future. We did a deep dive into our vehicle fleet this year. So overall in the DES, we've got about 200 vehicles charged to the general fund. We've decided to defer replacement of 75 of those vehicles and eliminate 3 vehicles from the fleet. That includes 2 from the motor pool. Lastly, we know there's uncertainty on when the community centers will open and what level of hours they will have, which affects then in turn the DES portion, which is the utility and custodial services. And so we've worked really closely with Parks and we are trying to match their proposal. That's all in the general fund. Mr. Chair, I think it's probably just makes sense that I just keep rolling on for a couple more minutes through blow through a few remaining funds.
Sounds good. Thank you.
So we'll hit the auto fund real quick. So year to year, the auto fund moves around depending on what is due for replacement and how much it costs. This year, the increases are driven primarily by fire apparatus replacements, and those are expensive equipment. We also deferred more vehicles than normal, partially driven by the pandemic, which then saves an additional $4.9 million total with these numbers. So for context, the auto fund total is about 946 vehicles. Of course, when we do this, it saves money for the departments. They're no longer charged for the annual replacement amount, but when it's deferred, we do charge them a lesser amount, a reduced amount, for just maintaining that older vehicle. Also, we stretch our comfort zone and proposed dropping 2 mechanics this year that were vacant. We'll see if we can maintain the appropriate service levels with those cuts. One of those supports the light vehicle fleet section, and the other one supports complex construction engineering equipment. We'll move on to the print fund. In the print fund, we saw overall demand and revenues drop rather dramatically with the office environment changes with the pandemic. Of course, certain important mailings like real estate assessments continued and other important mailings. So we'll closely monitor this situation in the print fund as we come out of the pandemic, and we may need to make some future changes as well. In the meantime, within the fund, we did scrub our licenses and our contracts with Xerox, and we cut the number of large-scale printers down to manage expenses. Moving to the Boston Garage. The pandemic had a dramatic impact on parking and thus revenues in the Boston Garage. So to help reduce expenses, we reduced contracted security presence during the day from 2 persons down to 1 between 7 and 11. And we are reducing contracted cleaning services as well. So with a 32% budgeted revenue drop, we have a real challenge here. And thus we are going to use the economic stability reserves in 21 and 22 to fund the garage operations. So, we normally try to target the reserve to be around $1 million for the garage. And just for context, we anticipate it dropping to about 124,000 by the end of FY22. And then we would be required to pay back those reserves within 3 years by policy. So if revenues turn out to be worse than expected in FY22, or we have an unanticipated capital maintenance need of the garage, the county may need to borrow funds from the Ballston Garage 8th level fund. And there on the 8th level, we went into the pandemic with a much better position, and the 17% revenue drop that we project here was not as dramatic because the Iceplex maintained a lot of their operations. So balances at the end of the FY22 are estimated to be at 1.6 million. All right, so that was a lot of funds for DES. We are now happy to address your questions as best we can.
Thank you, Mr. Emanuel. And I think that is important sort of starting note as we move to questions. Mr. Karantonis mentioned, as you did, that 65% of the roughly 500 people in the department are still in person. So I think it's important for us to start by just recognizing and thanking all of those who are working. You also mentioned the call center. This has not been an easy year, and both flexibility and commitment to public service have been stretched. So with that, I don't know if colleagues have questions. I don't see a hand yet, so I will start with one that I think could go to both. It's in the area that Chair McIntyre mentioned. This is studies. You mentioned, this year is a bridge year as a budget as a whole, and so many positions are frozen. But I wondered, in the air area, the Arlington Initiative to Rethink Energy area, are there, we're hoping that there will be additional federal resources, and we have the implementation framework to do over the next 6 months. But do you have thoughts of, during this time, kind of like we've done some more construction because people are not driving as much, do you have thoughts with respect to analysis and how we might position ourselves, maybe one-time costs for appropriate consultant reports? How do we position ourselves so that next year and the year after we can make bigger progress on our climate change goals? Or, you may not have specific thoughts, but I wondered if you or your team might have ideas in this area.
Well, I'll take an initial shot at it, and then, if we need to go deeper, I can ask Demetra, because she and her team have been so aggressive in this area across, as I tried to explain, across so many areas of the county government and across the community. I believe we're well positioned, and I don't think that it's kind of hard to budget for something that you don't know what it is. But I'm again, because of our fiscal situation overall, and because the air fund sits in the middle of the general fund, and we've got what, $107 million of expenses. If I've got a $50,000 need for a study, we can make that happen in budget execution without specifically allocating to a specific study.
Sure.
And we have great relationships with the consultants, and know the industry, and members of C2E2 know people, and we can get to experts. If we don't have that in-house expertise, I'm confident if something comes up, we can go figure it out.
Great.
Just simply in budget execution. We're blessed in DES that we've got a lot of flexibility given the size of the budget.
Great, that's helpful. I do see Ms. McBride, and I see Mr. Dorsey with a question after that. But Ms. McBride, did you want to add anything in this area?
Just very quickly to back up Greg, we are in the process of #1, an energy assurance study. and that is for resiliency in the long term, and that incorporates projected climate change. We have delivered the 3 interim deliverables on electrification of transportation. One of those is the comparative study for the total cost of ownership. I was going to, have this as a surprise, but within the next couple of months, we're also going to be launching an EV 101 web page that's going to have several, sub pages on that. We are actually launching a ART bus, as Greg had mentioned earlier. Assessment study. At the same time, on top of that, we're also launching the EV Ready Community Master Plan. That's going to include a number of different elements, including a siting plan, a strategic siting plan for charging infrastructure. And there is a lot of flux in renewables right now that we would need 2 more sessions to explain. But we've been in constant contact with Greg and Mike Moon, and they understand that. And we've been assured that, number one, if there's an expertise that we feel is critical to meet this rapid flux and dynamic change in that area or another area, as Greg said, we can accommodate that. And also, if there are key opportunities, we do have one of our consultants that is reporting back to us on a weekly basis on the federal developments. And we are also in contact directly with the state agencies on the disposition of the RGGI funds, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, as well as a bank of renewable energy resources that DEQ is sitting on. I actually had to rearrange that call for this meeting today, but we're rescheduling for next week. So I hope that answers your kind of immediate.
Sure, it sure does. It looks like colleagues may have questions in this area as well, but mostly I'm really glad to hear that the federal, you're staying in touch on federal possibilities, and we seem well positioned. Thank you to both you and Mr. Emanuel for that. I'll hold off, and I think we've got questions. Mr. Dorsey.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll start with this first one, budget question. So in the budget book and in your presentation, you look at the capital project coordinators picking up their overhead with the Transportation Capital Fund. While, that looks painless, you intimated that would have an impact come CIP in terms of the portfolio of projects. And I was wondering if at this point you could give us a sense of what might be the scope of some of those portfolio shifts that we might be baking into this budget action before we've had a chance to actually look at the CIP.
Yeah, it's a good question, Mr. Dorsey. Thank you. There is kind of that weird timing because we do them in that sequence. But we're confident that the big things that we've laid out there and committed to for the community, for the really large projects, for everything from the Crystal City East entrance to other metro projects, to big projects down, the Transitway, all these things, the Columbia Pike project, all those things are going to be able to move ahead as we plan. I don't think it's going to have a significant impact on the big projects in our portfolio. And maybe Dennis can add some more. Dennis Leach can add some more there. But as we're starting to build that CIP right now, I don't think it's going to have a meaningful impact that the community is going to see with that charge out of overhead.
Okay.
Greg, I'll just add to respond. Our CIP is quite large and we have diverse funding sources. Yeah. We take our CIP planning responsibilities really seriously. We've been undertaking an effort to really look 10 years out, even though our upcoming CIP will be 3 years. But we are looking at how to deliver a very large program. And I think our financial staff feel that we can absorb this modest amount of indirect charges. These project managers already charge about 70% of their cost to individual projects. So this proposal is for the capital fund to pick up the remainder.
Okay, well, I would just say that if somehow our revenue projections, for that fund based on declining assessments and a closer look reveals that there might be some consequences that are likely to cause us pain, that you bring that to us hopefully before this budget process is complete so that we can adequately factor that in.
Very good.
We can do that.
And I've got more, but I'm happy to wait for round two. I think the chairman was intimating that I should do another one.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Go ahead.
So the next one was a little bit more speculative, but given the experience that we had with ART this spring, where ridership was really, maybe perhaps more robust than at least I would have expected for a while during the pandemic. I would imagine to some degree that was attributable to free fares, in addition to people having limited options. I'm wondering if we have conceived of a way to think about what might be the cost, benefit, and value of considering reduced or free fares on ART and the associated reductions in vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions so that we could better evaluate the budgetary impact of not collecting revenue on ART with the overall value of getting closer to our CEP goals.
That is a question that is a great one. I had not totally connected all those dots, and so I appreciate that, Mr. Dorsey. I will tell you, in the short term, if we went back to that slide, maybe on the ridership, what's interesting is we did not see the drop off after we started collecting fares, and so we just squeezed in that latest amount of the latest ridership numbers there. So we were concerned about that, particularly because we have some of our riders, transit's their only real option given their situation, but we did not see the drop off in ridership. So I don't know, Dennis, you may have other thoughts on that.
Sure. I'll just provide these additional thoughts. One is anything that we do needs to be done in close coordination with our state funding partner. DRPT is a major funder of our program, providing about 18% covering 18% of the operating costs for ART. And so there would be coordination there. I would also just mention that until we are able to design, construct a maintenance facility, our capacity will be limited for the next few years. So I think our short-term focus is really to stabilize the ART operation, to begin rebuilding our ridership base while planning for the future. We do have a major update to our transit plan that we will undertake in coordination with the state in fiscal 23 and completed in fiscal 24. So I just leave you with those thoughts.
Thank you. I realize price elasticity in transit is an imperfect science at best, and this is very difficult to sort of figure out at what point we're going to get more people to actually choose transit, and it gets even trickier when you're thinking about ART as a specific mode. But I would maybe encourage us to not lose sight of maybe thinking about that as we're dealing with the fundamental ART issues that you are. I'll defer for now. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Leach and Mr. Emanuel.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. If we have additional thoughts on that, we'll kind of put our heads together between particularly Ms. McBride, Mr. Leach, and Lynn, of course, our transit team, who leads our transit team so capably, and we'll see where that goes.
Great. It's a reasonable question, but also an economist with some regression analysis. I felt like there'd be a way that, we might be asking you back for a little assistance. I'm not quite sure who is next. In this case, I'll start with Ms. Garvey and then Mr. Carantonis, Ms. Crystal.
Well, I was actually last. It should be Ms. Crystal and Mr. Carantonis. Is that okay if I go over to Ms. Crystal?
Sure. Thank you.
I take that only because just to pick up where Mr. Dorsey left off.
Yeah.
I think in some ways it's so frustrating that we've had this opportunity for a natural experiment that so many of us would have relished the opportunity to learn from about what happens when you make transit free. It's just that it has coincided with a spectacular and nationwide, probably international drop-off in transit ridership due to the pandemic. And so we don't actually, that's a pretty big confounding variable. But I love that sort of hypothesis that Mr. Dorsey was advancing, that actually the investment required could end up being one of the biggest bangs for our buck when it comes to our energy goals. And that's all sort of a comment stipulating right before I dive into a question about electric vehicles. I do sometimes think that we focus excessively on electric vehicles when in fact still the best way to reduce energy use of any kind is to get people out of individual or even carpool vehicles and into transit. So I think that's the right place to be focused. And actually, maybe I'll put my money where my mouth is and start with my first question about transit then before I go to the EVs. So I wonder, the route 15K, the bus route 15K that we're looking to sort of pull funding from. There's so much up in the air, Mr. Manuel, as you were noting, about kind of Metro bus service, and especially when we're starting to look now at the Q3 of fiscal 22, which is to say January, when it comes to Metro's budget, right? This would be the time, at least in what the general managers proposed, some pretty big service cuts would go into effect with the buses and Metro rail service, absent more federal relief. And so I just wondered, to what extent has Metro, this bus line, played a role in backup service during station closures with East Falls Church Metro, during Safe Track or previous examples. I know there are some proposed targeted closures or probably at best reduced headways at East Falls Church that could be going into effect unless Metro's budget changes between now and next January. And so is it possible that we, in removing this, could be cutting off one of our major sort of lifeline bus services absent or in the event of a station closure? Has your team thought about that? That's a little in the weeds, I know.
No, that's a good question. I'm going to turn that one over to Dennis or Lynn Rivers. I think they have more details than I will on that. Sure.
This is an extremely low ridership route. It has been already changed once. And it is a route that Fairfax Connector has expressed interest in picking up. It's primarily transporting people that come into East Falls Church from Fairfax and then go off to Langley.
So it goes from the East Falls Church Metro station to Langley? That's
correct. There's only one trip per weekday left that goes from Roslyn at this point.
Okay, yeah, so there's not real redundancy with the Metro line. It's just a very different route.
That's right, and its ridership has been trending down over time.
Right. So my question was because we've relied on at least during Safe Track, right? We relied on our bus network, especially some of those redundant lines when there were station closures. What I'm hearing you say is that this is not going to get someone where the Metro station would be getting them anyway. So it's just sort of irrelevant.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so on the electric vehicle piece, and this was maybe a sort of a different flavor of what our chair was asking. We've talked a lot about transitions for the whole county fleet. You gave us some updates on that plan today. In the meantime, I think we'd sort of watch with interest. The Fairfax, I know their board just passed some months ago a resolution or guidance that beginning in fiscal 22, all of the eligible sedans purchased by the county would be electric. And so I think we've, struggled a little bit on the one hand, wanting a comprehensive plan and recognizing we still have a ways to go for that like proverbial electric fire truck, right? But the sedan seems like sort of the easier lift. At the same time, I know when I look at the automotive fund, the budget specifically noted that we deferred the purchase of 210 vehicles in fiscal 21 and would be deferring another 235 in this proposed year. So I think my question is a little bit, I had some interest coming into this budget of saying like, could we explore something similar to what Fairfax has done, at least on our sedans? But I guess the question is there a plan to purchase any sedans this year? Or when I look at those deferrals, are we essentially saying, because of lower usage during COVID and just the need to defer things in general in the budget, we'll be making such few automotive purchases this year. So to put a finer point on that question, what, if any, sort of the rough magnitude of sedans, this sort of typical county vehicles with the Arlington logo on them that we might be purchasing this year, if any?
Right. Well, in terms of the deferrals, let me add a couple more little more numbers of context. So for FY20, for example, we had 172 deferrals. In other words, because we always do this process is, do you really need the vehicle? Do we, we don't want to, from a economic standpoint, we don't want to turn it in prematurely if it doesn't have the mileage and so forth. So in FY20, we had 172 deferrals. FY22, we added another 90 above that. So that just shows you kind of the order of magnitude of,
okay.
I guess we're at about, we went up another 50%. That's an indication of how much the pandemic is. And so we just
this is not the biggest deal in the world, but those numbers are different than what's in the budget book under Automotive Equipment Fund.
Okay.
That on page 858 or the hard copy suggests that we've total deferred closer to like 200 or 450 across the 2 years.
I guess we got to get to the specifics of what's in the general fund, what's in the utility fund, what's in the total.
I see.
So that changes the conversation.
Okay, got it.
So.
Okay, so that's the deferral. So I guess the question is, what's left? Like, do we still anticipate replacing some of our sedans this fiscal year?
Good question. I don't have those numbers exactly, but we can get back to you on how many we're replacing this year going forward.
I would be interested in saying, just trying to get my arms around both, what is the number of sedans that we anticipate producing or replacing? And, are there, if it's a small enough number, are there any additional costs for additional charging infrastructure, et cetera? If we were to say, we're going to start, there are cost-effective sedans on the market right now that are electric vehicles. It's a small step, but it's one we could maybe start getting our arms around while we come up with that longer term strategic plan. So both the number and then sort of associated costs of charging infrastructure, et cetera, if we were to say in the year ahead, those sedans being replaced should be EVs.
Sure. And just a few more details on the actions we took since the last board budget on this and the decisions we made. We went ahead, and installed the charging infrastructure, for example, over at fire station number 4. That's there, that's up and ready to go. And we've got charging here at the Bosman Government Center that's ready to go to receive those vehicles when they come in. So we've got the infrastructure in place for those vehicles that we've ordered that are coming in around the 4th of July.
Great.
So we're good there.
Okay.
And I've challenged Chris Allison, our Equipment Bureau Chief, also to look at the next class of vehicles, even while we're simultaneously with Ms. McBride studying them in detail. So if I look out my window here, I can see about a dozen of those tall Sprinter vans. They look a lot like those Amazon delivery vans. You may have seen that Amazon is pursuing the electrification of their delivery vans. And so we're going to see if we can get into that market. And, maybe so Chris is actively looking at that and seeing if we can get another vehicle class going at the same time, not just sedans. So
that's really exciting. That's even better.
So that's not official yet. We're just, that's where we're pressing and trying to get going in other areas. And seeing what we can do.
Thank you.
And that, for example, that vehicle class would be so perfect for electrification because they're short trips.
Yeah.
They don't need a lot of. They're not running around the county all day. They're mobile work. It's the mobile workshop for my HVAC and facility technicians. Mm-hmm. And so they go from here to there to that facility. In Little Arlington, they're not going to use that much charge during the day.
Yeah.
So it's a perfect. If we can get that vehicle going, I think that'll be our next target.
That's great. Thank you. And I think that's all about, And I know we've got Ms. McIntyre still here. We'd asked her to stay, so I don't know if she wanted to weigh in on the EV discussion broadly. But I think about some of the really good feedback we've gotten from C2E2 and other advocates in our community, and it's all about like making interim progress, right, towards these big goals. And so, trying to make sure that we're not letting, again, the proverbial electric fire truck and our inability to get there because the market isn't offering that hold up all of these steps we can be making. So I don't know if Ms. McIntyre had anything to say on the electric vehicles, and I'm that concludes my comments anyway, beyond listening from him.
Yes, as you probably know already, we strongly endorse moving towards electrical vehicles, and we've actually been pretty vocal looking even at the new facility as to making sure that that is going to be electric vehicle ready. So I, would strongly encourage the county, as I said, let's get a set schedule in place as to when we're going to be purchasing all electric vehicles. And right now it seems like it's completely economically feasible to do sedans. And then, as I say, if there's other classes, let's go for them. So that I'd actually come back to the mention is I would actually suggest moving up the study on the transportation, because I think we really need a huge focus on getting to reduced, increased use of public transportation and other multimodal things to really reduce those vehicle miles traveled. And I don't think the current master transportation plan fully reflects that goal. Mm-hmm. And I think I've heard someone kind of mention it's like 90% of the residents can get 90% of their transportation needs 90% of the time. I mean, some sort of big goal like that as to how do you get there and move that up, because transportation is, I think, 38% of total carbon emissions.
Yeah.
And as you said, we're not going to get there if we just reduce, just shift up to all electrical vehicles.
Yeah. I like that about the framing around a big goal. I know the MTP update will be upon us before we know it. Yeah. But I think the idea of trying to kind of adopt some guiding goal, right? Like we have with the CEP or even with our, Parks Public Spaces Master Plan is a really interesting thought. Thank you. Right, and I'm sorry to cut you off, Mr. Manuel.
I just wanted to add, while we're talking about sedans, to be transparent. We worked really, really, really hard. We had to work a special deal. We worked with the county attorney and to try to minimize the cost difference. But there is still a cost difference. So the lease we were able to get down to $24,367 per vehicle. But a non-electric Nissan Sentra cost us $16,600, or an Altima cost us $19,110. So there's still that cost difference, and when you scale it up in a budget year that's tough, that becomes challenging for us, amongst other cuts we're making. But we did have good success at bringing down the cost due to the hard work of many people to bring down the cost of the lease. So it's just, there's still the gap.
There's sure. Also the life cycle cost is less for an electric vehicle.
And we just got the drafts last week of those life cycle costing things. I haven't had a chance to open them yet. So when we get those out, when we have confidence in those, we will share those, and people can start seeing the big picture. And of course, we'll have to update the study about every 6 months, as much as this is changing, and there's other things legislatively happening, and that is going to change the market. And Ms. McBride and I have been talking in a very enthusiastic manner about where that crossover point occurs and when it happens, and when the big behavior shifts change. Those things are coming, they're not far away.
Thank you, Mr. Emanuel and Ms. Crystal, for the question, as well as Ms. McIntyre for pointing out the benefits. And I know we're all interested in this, the actions of the legislature over the past few months. There's been progress there. So I'll be interested in the answer, the sort of along the lines of Ms. Crystal, the follow-up that's there. And I also won't ask a question, but I will just say that if there's one-time electric vehicle infrastructure costs that may be helpful, that also is of interest to me. So I think we had the right order from Ms. Garvey, which is Mr. Karantonis next, and then you. Go ahead, Mr. Karantonis.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. To pick up again with Mr. Dorsey's comment, Ms. Garvey and I, we had a briefing that the Transit Bureau was very kind to provide us, and we saw how demand inelastic, how price inelastic demand was in the ridership. How the ridership, we have a part of the riders of ART right now who don't. These are riders who don't have any choice, so they pay the $2 per trip. And I mean, again, as an economist, the only thing that occurs to me is to actually think aggressively how to progress towards a different type of tariffs, like, for example, incentivizing a better use of cards, of time cards, of multi-trip cards, and through this, make it more of a better deal to use public transit on a long term. I do believe that actually our choice riders will also be a little bit more responsive to that. But this is it's a more complicated economic model to think through. I do believe that the cards exist. I just don't think that we have studied them enough. Arlington is an excellent, in my opinion, Arlington is an excellent market to study that, because there is a lot of ART is a system where you know that connects short trips where cards could make a very big difference. It's really taking the bus is really an easy thing to do. You get to where you want to go relatively fast. It's not a lesser model, so to say, at least not in my mind. The other thing on the fleets and the transition to EVs, one of the biggest transitions to EVs, as we are beginning to see even in our region, is that also the financing model of how we finance our fleets and maintain them is transitioning. We will probably see, and we'll have to study more leasing models for these fleets instead of purchasing and holding the capital risk. I do think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I believe that Ms. McBride is working on this, and I'm very, very excited to see that. And to Mr. Manor, to your feasibility projection for short trip, for the short trips, the sighting study is something I'm extremely interested in, to see where we think that, how we start with an initial network of EV charging stations. To my question though, and it goes back to Mr. Collins's presentation on the rate study. So we have a lot of multifamilies that are affordable housing. They charge right now their residents in kind of a bulk way. So they mix the costs. So how do we want to incentivize those owners? First of all, what's the burden that we can predict especially for market rate and committed affordable housing multifamily? And the second question is, what do we do to incentivize the owners of these apartments, to be fair to their tenants, and if they pay less, to transfer the benefit, or if they pay more, to make sure that they incentivize economizing water, etc.
Yeah, so that is a great question, and you're getting to one of the real challenges we have in affecting that specific demographic. And I think the short answer is to say that the best we can say is we can say pretty well across the board, costs for multifamily residences will go, costs for multifamily accounts will go down. So the best that we can really say is we will not be putting any pressure on rent rates with this rate study. We don't have a way, and we have looked nationally at programs that try to get beyond to what we call our indirect customers, get behind the apartment manager or get behind the HOA. And we have not found any models that do that. I saw an article in the past couple of weeks that Seattle is looking into something like that, but there really isn't a model to do that. So really, our best response is this rate study does nothing. There's nothing in here that increases the pressure on our rental rates in the county. We can't go far enough to say that we're reducing burdens or costs on the individual individual tenants.
Thank you. I yield, Mr. Judge.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis and Mr. Collins for that background. Ms. Garvey.
Thank you. A couple of things. Let's see. So I'll go back to Mr. Dorsey's line of questioning, because he was, and Ms. Crystal talking about how this chain, when we had free transit, it would have been a great study except for COVID. And then I was remembering, Mr. Manuel, that you said we had a lot of money for consultants that we could use to study things if we needed to. Could we do a pilot study here in Arlington where we provide free art transit once we're back to certain levels and see how that goes for a while? Just suggesting.
We can certainly look into that.
I saw the swallow, the gulp.
The gulp was like, how does that work in a, because a lot of people jump between modes, or they jump from rail to bus, and how does that work on the whole trip? And so I didn't have an answer figured out for that.
No, you don't have to have an answer. I'm just going to toss the thing as we were talking about.
That's something we can get back to you on. Appreciate the question.
Yeah, I mean, free transit, or using a system of passes where you get one pass, and the more you use it, the cheaper it is. Anyway, if there's anything we could do with that to experiment here with our art system, I know it's harder with Metro. I think that'd be great. So thank you. And then a question for you, Mr. Emanuel, that is probably you might not be able to answer. So in 2019, I think did this feasibility study for a solar array at the pumping station at Minor Hill. What happened with that? Did we do that? What?
We did not do that. It didn't pencil out. So Demetra, maybe you can, top of your head, remember some of the details on that. No. But it did not pencil out. And I'll just turn it over to Demetra for more details.
Ultimately, it didn't pencil out, and there were geographic issues just in the actual site conditions there that were a problem. But we decided to go a little bit bigger. So
good.
We're going through some legal and some procurement hurdles because it's complicated. But there were 2 other contracts within the state that we were looking for the potential to ride for rooftop, third-party solar developers. So there's no upfront capital cost to the county for Lubber Run.
That sounds great, because the more we could, thank you, because I'm just interested. It kind of, this sort of brings together so many different things. You've got energy, and the renewables, and you've got security issues. And I want to just touch on those a little bit, and then I'll finish up actually with a big thank you, but we'll finish. Mr. Collins, are you able to put up that map that I did a little bit in the chat? It just really struck me, of all the pipes, with all the blue pipes and some red pipes, because that really changed my view of things a little bit.
Well, I can't do that, but I'm sure one of our competent staff can do it, and it will be up in a moment.
Somebody can do that while we're doing it. There we go. Oh, yeah. So, this is, as you know, it struck me. I started to realize we're really, in many ways, we're not talking about water. We're talking about the delivery system. That's where the cost is. It's in all of those pipes. The water itself is relatively small, and of course we have to purify it. So I think it might be instructive just for a moment while we're sort of think of a big thank you. Think about Texas, because in Texas they had some freezing weather, and I think this is that system that's just fallen apart. And they're continuing to have a lot of trouble because it's not properly insulated. They don't keep it up. They're in many ways not doing what they ought to provide a reliable system. And we are, and you don't even think about it until it breaks. So just a big thank you. But I think it's important. This map is just, it makes you think about what goes into delivering the water, what an incredible infrastructure it is, and we don't even see it because it's underground. So that's huge. And then it brings me a little bit, and we don't need to go over that right now, is the issue of security. We haven't talked too much about infrastructure security, and maybe we don't want to here, but we've also been seeing little bits of that where, I don't know, it's the Russians, the Chinese, or whatever, they start to play games and can play with these systems, which would be catastrophic. So maybe that's not something we want to talk about even publicly, and probably not prepared to now, but that's another issue that I continue to be concerned about. And I assume we've got money in the budget and we're looking at it, because the security of these systems is really crucial. And then back to where I started, and then I'll be done. The solar arrays, if we could get solar here where it provides the energy for a pumping station or for whatever, then when that wonderful solar energy thing all the way down in Southern Virginia that's pumping it all to us and giving us renewable energy, and those lines get cut or whatever, we've got energy on site. And I think that would add over time more security, be better actually for the environment. So I'd love to see us be able to move to that, and delighted to hear about Lover Run. So that was it. And finally, just again, a big thank you, because we've had cold weather, we've had a pandemic, and all through it, the water's flowed, the electricity's been on, the pipes get repaired, the roads are taken care of, and all by employees who are working, showing up day after day in really difficult conditions. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you for noting the commitment of our employees, because they have, as you said, shown up every day.
Yeah, it's just amazing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. I think that concludes, unless there's follow-up questions. I think it's the right note to conclude on. I do want to make just one. We haven't had a bevy of questions for you, Mr. Collins, about all the work you're doing. And I think that may be partly because at this stage, at least for me, and I think for other board members, we're really pleased with the direction it's going. We have much work to do. But don't take that as anything but a thank you in that sense. And I think Ms. Garvey has it exactly right. The 500 of the department's employees who are working to keep us all in our homes and our apartments with water and electricity, you just need look to the challenges of Texas and the challenges of some of our climate issues that we've had over the past years, to just reiterate our deep thanks for what you're doing, for Mr. Emanuel, your team, and all that's being done. I think with that, unless Mr. Manager, you have any closing comments, we will.
I wanted to thank everyone, and I know Mr. Carantonis asked a question earlier, but I'd like to say I support a czar-free diet if people are asking about adding a position to the manager's office. So there you go. So the propensity for puns, I love that. I can associate myself with Mr. Carantonis, that the possibility of that I think that we all take seriously the question that Ms. McIntyre has put before us. We also are trying to marry that point with the challenges of the budget and of this budget. With the long-term goals we must achieve on climate. So thank you for that closing, Ms. Garvey and Mr. Manager. And with that, colleagues, we're adjourned for today.